Cyberpunk Orion has been officially announced, and with Phantom Liberty sadly being the only expansion planned for CD PROJEKT RED for Cyberpunk 2077, we'll be waiting quite some time for another Cyberpunk game. I voiced my own disappointments about how Phantom Liberty is the one and only expansion, mostly because I believe that the very valid criticisms of the game took the wind out of the sails of future expansion plans. But taking the good with the bad and learning that CDPR are going to be releasing this only on next gen, and the fact that 350 people have been working on it for quite some time now, I'm gonna hope that we get enough content here and maybe even some multiplayer functionality to keep coming back for years to come. I know mods are going to add longevity to the game, and with 2077 building some momentum on Nexus, and with CDPR releasing REDMOD, I think the game is in the very capable hands of the community for right now. In fact, I think CDPR knows that the community can output so much more content than they ever could for the obvious reason of sheer manpower, but I can't say that I'm not disappointed that that will be a wrap from an official standpoint post-expansion. There is, however, a lot of good in the future of the Cyberpunk universe, with CDPR setting up shop in Boston and Vancouver for a fully fleshed out Cyberpunk sequel, led by everyone's favorite chum Paavo Sasko, and I think that despite 3 Witcher projects being on the go for CDPR, Orion is looking to be a concentrated effort and fully realized in its scope, helping it stand toe-to-toe with all the content it seems Witcher fans will be getting soon. Don't get me wrong, I love The Witcher, I'll be playing everything that comes out from that universe, but a dual franchise model kinda indicates that the franchises will be balanced, which in my early opinion is kinda to be determined. Nevertheless, Cyberpunk 2 or 2078 or Orion or whatever you want to call it, being developed on Unreal Engine 5 and being the last project slated in the pipeline with a new studio filled with veterans heading it is a very exciting prospect. So today I wanted to go over my top 10 wish list for Orion based on learnings from Cyberpunk 2077. These are in order all the way up to my most wanted features, and I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say on this. If you agree, if you disagree, let me know in the comments, I want to hear from you. At number 10, we have a more expansive CYBERWARE catalog. DLC content has added new CYBERWARE options, but in comparison to what was seen in Cyberpunk 2020 and the source material, CDPR hasn't even scratched the surface when it comes to CYBERWARE. And with just a few options at launch, I definitely feel like CDPR can enable more character customization, starting with a much more expansive array of CYBERWARE options. I'm sure issues around balance were probably thrown around a lot within CDPR, which might be the reason why there wasn't as much variety, but I'd imagine balance can be tweaked based off of player feedback when Orion launches. I mean, let's be honest, there were builds that came out with Cyberpunk 2077 like the Gunslinger build that I preferred, where you were critting 200k plus, and the power spike you could experience regardless once you got halfway through the game or so. Makes me feel like even if we did have more CYBERWARE options and the balance was a little bit more skewed, it wouldn't really be that big of a deal. Arms in particular are a huge sore spot, as we only got the nanowire, the mantis blades, the gorilla fists, and the projectile launch system, when the lore of Cyberpunk has rippers, they have chainsaws, they even have pillows as hands. I think even just more aesthetic CYBERWARE options in the base game would be amazing. We really just can't look like a chromed out freak even if we tried without mods, and that doesn't really go with the whole concept of style over substance that Cyberpunk is known for. Wouldn't it be cool to make your character look like this? How about this? Or even if you installed a Sandviston, you'd have the whole back piece be visible on your character. I think 2077 really just didn't do a good job of this, so hopefully you can make your character super modular and get a diverse set of not only looks, but playstyles purely with the CYBERWARE. I'm not even going to get into how perks can play a role in that, and yeah, balance can be an issue, but if I had to take broken builds over lack of content, I'm taking broken builds all day long. At number 9 we have a controversial one, but one that I know a lot of you are starting to think of and want. With all CDPR games launching with multiplayer and with a fully fleshed out multiplayer once planned, this is something I really hope we get. Speaking of the planned multiplayer, data mines from 2077 show that deathmatch and heists were both planned. And although I'm less keen on deathmatch, heists, if done well, would make Night City feel so much more alive. Imagine getting together with your buddies and having your Edgerunner crew like in the anime, running missions which would come out on a regular basis. You could choose to be a techie solo netrunner and cause chaos across the city and compete with other crews in challenges and through leaderboards. With Unreal Engine 5 powering the world and with CDPR being as ambitious as they are, nothing is outside the realm of possibility. It also just makes good business sense. Live service games have by far the largest margins. And yes, although CDPR have made statements that they will never lose their single player RPG first DNA, I think game development is always in a state of flux and things could change. And I think the Cyberpunk universe will be better for it should they choose to embrace multiplayer. At number 8, we have, yes, a longer main storyline. I love The Witcher 3 because it felt like an epic saga that took me to a variety of locations. It felt like a long, slow burn of a build-up, and I think that really helped me get invested into the world. Cyberpunk 2077's main storyline feels like it's over before it's even begun. I feel like I just started to get into it and then it was over, and that asshole Johnny just yoinked my body and called it a day. Not only this, but there was a ton of talk about the dissonance between being on the clock for survival throughout the main story. Meanwhile, V is out there running little gigs and side quests for every Tom, Dick, and Harry as Johnny starts to eat away at your brainstem. I think the concepts of the story were great, I think the writing that helps tell the story is great, but I also think that there just wasn't a ton of meat on the bones of the main storyline. 3 to 5 more mainline characters and like maybe 15 to 20 hours more would have been probably pretty ideal for me, but I'm curious to what you guys think. I'm hoping Phantom Liberty kinda makes up for this, but it seems to me that when compared to The Witcher, which took me like 60 hours to complete, without counting Blood and Wine and Hearts of Stone, Cyberpunk is just not as content heavy. Again, Phantom Liberty, if it's anything like Blood and Wine, could be 40 hours in itself, and maybe I'd be less inclined to complain about this one, and there is the argument of replayability, but most people will only play the game once. It's just something to keep in mind. At number 7, we have more exploration on certain factions and gangs in Night City. In Cyberpunk 2077's base game, Trauma Team is pretty much non-existent narratively speaking after the Sandra Dorset mission. Edge Runners, even in a 10-episode miniseries, gave us a better snapshot into the lives of MAXTAC, and we even got some visuals and the despair associated with Trauma Team, but the game just didn't even dive into the topic whatsoever. V's story is important, the average street dweller and their stories are important, gang stories are important, corpo stories are important, but these fringe factions that are some of the most interesting in the base game got very little love, and they just so happen to be some of the most interesting ones. I will say there is a very nice homage to the 2013 trailer with Melissa Rory and this little quest line, but this encounter is like 5 minutes and is pretty much just fan service. Trauma Team has an entire comic book series from Dark Horse that, although isn't my favorite comic book in the Cyberpunk universe, dives deeper into the nuanced nature of being a Trauma Team medic and the choices Trauma Team squads have to make. Now we play as V, and it's kinda hard to make V as a bystander to all these different street stories, which might even beg the question on if we need multiple protagonists in Orion. This would be something that we could cycle through like GTA 5. Each character would have their own build and would be able to get integrated into the stories that make the most sense for their backstory and their history, versus V experiencing everything in the Cyberpunk universe, which just really isn't realistic or feasible. I know V has a death sentence, but maybe Phantom Liberty or engram implications can kinda change this. This is also an issue with gangs. Gangs are reduced to cannon fodder in the game. In the Cyberpunk sequel, I hope we get more into the reasons why the gangs are the way they are, why they do the things they do, and what got them to this moment. Something a little bit more in depth. At number 6, we have vehicle and weapon customization. As gaming progresses, the need for one to be able to express one's individuality is going to be key, and in the Cyberpunk universe, this should be even more so the case. Iconic variations of weapons are great, and the car designs in Cyberpunk are second to none, but no customization of these means that we're reliant on modding. Multiplayer shooters do this well, and although I'm not saying we need charms and monetizable cosmetics, what I am saying is that slapping on a new coat of paint and a few stickers here and there would really help you stick out as an individual. I'm not a game developer, so I won't embarrass myself with my hot takes on the ease of implementation of some of these features, but this seems like low-hanging fruit. At number 5, we have more dynamic combat, but I want to clarify what I mean here. I don't actually mean this for the player. If you're skilled enough and you have built your character in a certain way, you can be incredibly creative with the way you approach combat. You can play Cyberpunk literally like a point-and-click adventure, or you can play it like Doom 2077. I think CDPR nailed this. The sore spot here is actually in the enemy AI and how enemies engage in combat. I think the only standout thing I see here is sometimes high-level enemies will use Sandvistan on you, and sometimes you'll get some diversity with drones, or a baddie or cyber psycho that has some unique ability, but for the most part, enemies don't use the sandbox of the game to even a fraction of the degree that you can. When has an enemy used a nanowire against you? How about the projectile launch system? I see a ton of enemies with the mantis blades, but they use the same 4 or 5 recycled animations. I genuinely hope that in Orion we get to see enemies use more than 5 brain cells when entering combat. I know that sounds harsh, but for those of us keeping a pulse on the marketing of the game, and don't worry, we'll get into that later, we were led to believe that enemies would be a little bit more resourceful, tactical, diverse. Everyone is also the same height and relatively humanoid, which doesn't help it feel like Night City is the hostile environment that even the Edge Runners anime makes it feel like. At number 4, we have multiple locations. This to me is a super tricky one because where do you realistically go when you've invested all this time and energy into creating Night City on the Red engine, but now you're dropping support for the game engine in favor of one that's undoubtedly the better choice in the long run? Well, that either opens you up to having Cyberpunk 2 take place in another location, which I doubt, or combine multiple locations and be able to jump across the Americas. It's funny because obviously Night City is the central location in the lore, but in-game Arizona is referenced a lot, the combat zones of Detroit were the worst and continue to be the worst in 2077, and there's also the expanses of the net and space as being possibilities as well. The net really gives CDPR the freedom to pretty much do whatever they want, as long as there is a legitimate world-building reason for this. I think Braindance is very similar as well. Let's be honest here, the net in 2077 is criminally underutilized, although it is my assumption that in Phantom Liberty we will be spending some time behind the black wall. I can't see any reasonable explanation to not go there in 2077's first and only expansion. There are too many loose ends with the Voodoo Boys, Raish Bartmoss and the Rabbids, the data crash, Alt and the whole destruction of Mikoshi, to not have the net be a central element to the gameplay and narrative of Phantom Liberty. But if it's not, then first off I'll be pretty disappointed, and second off you can bet your ass Orion will feature it. There's also the Crystal Palace in space, which is actually a part of one of Cyberpunk 2077's endings, with the Mr. Blue Eyes conspiracy and the heist that takes place if you've unlocked that ending. But again, I'm betting my money on us getting a glimpse of this in Phantom Liberty as well. Regardless, there is a lot to explore with multiple locations, but I hope we don't forget about Night City, and I hope it feels fresh when Orion does inevitably come out. Opening up mega buildings and all the floors of these mega buildings, and opening up underground locations can definitely help it feel new, but I think it's a mistake to only focus on Night City in a sequel since we've already been there before in 2077. Let me know if you think this is a good idea in the comments below. I know a lot of you guys love Night City and would like to stay there, so curious to see what you guys have to say about this one. At number 3, we have more zaniness and more humor. Now I think CDPR has nailed the humor with Cyberpunk 2077, but you kinda have to do a lot of reading to get some of the best elements of this. Reading shards in general is vital to the overall enjoyment of playing Cyberpunk 2077, and that's something I think a lot of players won't spend a lot of time doing. Cyberpunk has also tried to be super realistic in the way it portrays itself, but I do wish that took itself a little less seriously. The crazy factor that is part of Pondsmith's universe takes a bit of a back seat, and I think this is something that would help express just how crazy a cyberpunk dystopia can get. At number 2, we have no balls to the wall, insanely hyped up marketing campaign where the game cannot possibly live up to the expectations of said marketing. Listen, I know by pure metrics, Cyberpunk 2077's marketing campaign was an overwhelming success. They had Cyberpunk plastered over what seemed like everything and anything they could, which to me is fine, but making sweeping, overwhelming statements that borderline on cocky and then failing to live up to those expectations is not a great long-term strategy. Under-promise and over-deliver has always been the most consumer-friendly approach, and a lot of the times, this simply just means not releasing something until it's ready, which if you remember is CDPR's whole shtick. They didn't listen to their own advice, and that's probably on higher-ups, which is why we've seen some of them step down, or even leave the organization, but please in the future, let the gameplay do the talking. I'm not opposed to big grandiose marketing campaigns. It does give us a lot of things to sink our teeth into, and it helps drive hype, but that hype has to be proportional to the end product. Aggressive marketing campaigns typically do have a higher ROI because it's pure awareness before a product is launched, and I'd imagine this will be repeated for Orion, potentially at a bigger scale. But seriously, some realistic statements would go a long way. At number 1, we have more open world reactivity and more interesting things to do and see in Night City. I think the biggest pain point in Night City is that it's a painting instead of a playground. It looks great and it's well laid out, but you can't enter many of the buildings, stores, and floors, and everyone just seems to be walking around doing a whole lot of nothing. It's a different medium, but I think Edgerunners did a great job of showing people throwing up on the streets, doing a whole bunch of wacky shit, people in car wrecks arguing with each other that hit them, amongst a billion other things, and I think Night City, to really feel like an authentic, real city, needs this. People yelling out of windows, cops chasing down criminals, some randomization of things that are happening in the world will go a long way. If Orion's Night City, or wherever Orion takes place, takes this open world reactivity into account, I think it will be the biggest win and a reason why people will come back time and time again to play and engage with the content. It's the most complicated ask, but it's also undoubtedly the most sought after feature in an open world game. If you guys are still playing and enjoying Cyberpunk 2077, I think you will enjoy it a bit better with this video on screen dissecting the whole history and lore of the Cyberpunk universe. Go check it out, and as always, consider subscribing if you enjoyed the content.